the recording. Good. So Maimonides. First time with Maimonides for y'all. First time reading some of you some real philosophy. So we're gonna do like we did last time with Job. We're gonna take a poll to see how you have absorbed the book, how you have encountered the book. So I'm gonna start from 1 to 10, right? 10 being it was amazing, ecstatic experience. 1 being the worst time of your life. So any 10s for Maimonides, you can put your hand in the screen. I'm on gallery view. Okay, no 10s. 9, 8, 7. Cruz, is that an 8? No. 7 for Williams. 6. All right, Milgram, 75. Now we're coming to the haters. 4. Rivera, Agurto. 3. Oh, Wilkes. Wilkes, is that a 3? Okay, 2, 1, 0. Okay, we'll start with the haters. We'll start with Wilkes and Milgram or Agurto, whoever wants to barge in. What happened?
I'll be honest, I was very confused. And I know that, like, I'm sure, you'll explain everything. But when I was reading it, I think the text was, like, it was just a little challenging for me. I understand that he's kind of like the middle point between, like, the philosophical thinkers and then the scripture readers. But I didn't really understand necessarily what he was trying to say.
Okay, that's normal. Right? To really understand Maimonides, you would need to know both Aristotle and the whole Hebrew Bible by heart. And the Muslim scholars, because he's right. So that's why a lot of you struggling, right? It's normal. Me too, right? It's not my specialty either, Maimonides. So it's difficult for me too. You have to really know Aristotle, really know the Muslim scholars of the time, and really know the Hebrew Bible, right? So it's normal. Yeah, good. Let's see. Let's take a lover because we don't have that much time today. So let me hear one lover on Maimonides. I think there was only one who was it Williams? Were you the only lover?
I gave it a 7.
Yeah, that's it. Williams, that's the highest score Maimonides got today.
Oh. It was pretty, well, at first I was as confused, definitely. But when you read it over again, you start to understand exactly what they're trying to say. Maybe I'm not right on what they're saying, but you have to read it a couple of times to understand it. So after I understood it, I was like, okay, I get it. I like some of the stuff they said.
Okay, very good. So you had to struggle a little bit, then you got it. Very good. Yeah, it's not easy. It's not easy. And by the way, it's only going to get worse, guys. This is like easy compared to what you're going to be facing later in the semester. But don't worry, I will be there to hold your hands. So, okay. So actually, before I get in the lecture, I want to address a couple points, which I'm sure some of you haters mentioned in your papers, right? A lot of you were complaining about 2 things. I want to talk about that briefly. Number 1, Maimonides' understanding of animals. Everybody's always defending animals. You know what? I'm gonna from now on tell students, if you want to defend animals, you first have to be a vegan, and then you have the right to speak up for animals. So look, because if you're eating animals, don't go around talking to me about how we should respect animals, right? So that's that's my response. But now to be more philosophical, yeah. So yes, indeed, right? Maimonides considers animals to be lower precisely because they don't have reason, right? And so in that, now then he makes a leap, which I think personally is inappropriate, which is therefore because they don't have reason, we can kill them. Right? So this is usually actually not, this is the view right now today, right? Why do we kill animals? Because they're not exactly like us. We wouldn't start eating people. Why? Because we think we're separate, right? So Maimonides is only stating the obvious for us today, that because they don't share in our reason, they don't have our status, it's okay to kill them. And then he makes this, so that, makes sense to a certain degree, although I agree with all of you who wrote down that, well, just because they're different doesn't mean that they're inferior and that they should be killed. I tend to agree with that, right? So now, having said that, Maimonides does talk about the humane killing of animals, which is something that our society has no clue about, right? So in the context of Judaism and Islam, there is a real intentional effort when you're slaughtering an animal to do it so that they don't feel pain, right? Both traditions are very careful to kill in a way that is pain-free for the animal, right? So he does have that, which is a little more progressive than where we are as a society today, right? Where we don't even care whether the animal suffers throughout their life and during the slaughter, right? We don't give a damn. So, okay, so now where Maimonides is problematic, really, for a lot of you, is when he talks about the different levels in human beings of reason, right? So we'll talk about that today. So there's the prophets, and then there's the virtuous and the learned, and then there is the impious, right? And how does he call them? This is on page, the ignorant and the impious, right? And who completely lack reason. And therefore, it's very logical. Because they lack reason, they're closer to the animals. And so killing them is not a big deal. So that's problematic, right? As problematic as perhaps killing animals, but it's problematic. Respler, I see you squirming. Go ahead, Respler.
So I just along those lines, I'm not like saying that what he's saying is completely true. Just kind of like a perspective on what he was saying in terms of like the different levels of like human beings and like reasoning in that sense. I think that from the way that I understood it, was that he's explaining how human beings have reasoning, which is that ability to go beyond their nature, right? Beyond like the animalistic like drive of just like pure desire, right? That's like an animalistic drive of like they don't have reasoning. They can't think like, oh, I should do this or that. It's like, oh, there's food in front of me, like I'm gonna eat it, or like there's potential food I will attack. There's no like ability for them to reason whether or not they should do that. Like they don't have that capacity of reasoning. And that's what defines humans as different than animals. And in that context, for the three levels of human beings, the way that I understood those three levels were that like the lowest level is somebody that cannot get beyond their animalistic behavior in that sense. Like they just go based on impulse. So I think his reasoning for saying that they could potentially be killable in that sense is if they aren't able to control their own animalistic impulse, then they probably would be much more like inclined to do crime, which would then create that. Meaning like if a human being is driven by their animalistic behavior, then like they will definitely be much more like likely to kill or steal or any of those things, as opposed to somebody who's worked on controlling that like impulse in that sense and allows that themselves to tap into that reason and drop more.
Yeah, very good. And I would extend what you said to the ignorant, as he calls it, right? If you're ignorant, you have a very low developed reason, and therefore there's more chance that you will be wicked, right? There's a connection in Maimonides between reason and virtue, right? So the less you use your reason, the more evil you are going to end up. And so you end up along with so where you are saying, Wrestler, right, that you cannot control your animal impulses because you don't have a strong reason, and therefore you end up being a criminal, and therefore, right, society will prescribe, right? Remember, this is not Maimonides saying that we should kill them. He's saying it is considered in general in society, right? It is commanded. He's not commanding, right? So he's saying society, therefore, for that reason, probably considers that it's okay to kill these people, or sometimes even necessary. But of course, here's where, right, I personally, right, I have an issue with that, even if the person is a complete beast. Does he still deserve, right? Do we still have the right to kill him? And I would extend that to animals, to be honest, but that's me. Okay, excellent. We had a little short debate on that issue. Now, let's get into the text so we can better understand what we just talked about, right? So I'm going to talk about two things today. Actually, I'm just going to talk about one. So before I start, let me summarize, right? Let me summarize actually the whole line of thought that we're going to study between the today and next time, right? That way you have a good idea of where we're going, why I picked those texts, right? And then we'll go into today the notion of reason and divine providence. What is reason? How does it connect to divine providence? What is divine providence, as some of you were asking, right? Okay, so here's the main, I'm going to give you the whole picture right now. That way you know where we're going. So remember the theme of the class is suffering. Where does evil come from? Why does God allow suffering, right? We saw this with the book of Job. Job is trying to respond to that, right? And now Maimonides is going to give us a different lens, right? As to why do we suffer and where is God, right? So Maimonides is actually going to be quite secular when it comes to suffering. He's going to simply say, God is not the cause of suffering, right? Cause of suffering, there are two causes. One is natural disasters, which don't come from God. They just come from the upheavals of nature. And two, our evil deeds, right? So suffering, God is not out there raining suffering on people, right? Or choosing who will suffer, right? So God is actually, we'll see in the text that he creates the world and then he kind of leaves it to a certain extent. We are very much responsible for what happens in the world. This is a very Jewish idea, right? So for him, we are the ones who are bringing most of our suffering. And if you think about it, think about all the times you suffered, there was always some human being, did this, right? Whether it was a human being who died because they couldn't take care of their own health, or a human being who created an accident, or a human being who, murdered someone. So it's always really, 99% of our suffering is brought on by ourselves, right? To each other or to our own self, right? So that's his belief, right? Now, what becomes interesting is that for Maimonides, we're not stuck there. We are not meant to suffer. We are meant to rise above our suffering, right? And so he actually gives us a path for that. And he says there is a part in us which is capable of attuning itself to God, right? And as such, it is capable of receiving divine wisdom, divine consolation, divine presence, and thereby rise above the suffering. In other words, we are maybe stuck in a horrible family situation or a horrible community situation, right? We're born in a certain community and now we're kind of conditioned to be like this, right? And he says, no, all of us have a path to come out of suffering, to come out of, our how shall I put, our mess, right? Whether it's the mess that we created or the mess that we were born in, we all have a path out via our reason. Why? Because our reason is a bridge to divine wisdom, right? And so divine wisdom can enter our reason and we can then take the necessary steps to come out of our suffering, right? Hark Stark, go ahead, you have a question.
So what is, if Maimonides says that one of the two reasons are natural disasters and bad deeds, but he's saying that God's not involved. So what's happening from the bad deeds? Like, how are you suffering from that?
Well, for example, if you smoke, 10 cigarettes a day, you're going to die of lung cancer. It's you.
That's called a bad. So what's it? Like, that's what a bad deed is?
Well,
like,
no,
that's not.
it doesn't have to be a bad deed. It can be an accident. It's a human deed. Human deeds. That's what I meant, right? Suffering is brought on by our deeds. Sometimes they're evil. Sometimes they're accidental. Sometimes they're ignorant, right? But we do this to ourselves. Does that make sense? Stark?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, very good. Yes, not necessarily bad. It can be accidental or ignorant, right? Out of ignorance. Okay, so back to the reason, right? So we'll talk about this today, the reason, right? Now, of course, we'll see that reason our reason is not naturally attuned to the divine. Our reason is not naturally open, not naturally pure, right? There are obstacles. And so there's a whole process, according to Maimonides, that we have to go through to prepare our reason to receive the divine light, right? And this particular process we'll talk about next time, right? Today we'll just talk about reason and divine providence, right? Divine providence, quick definition, right? For those who are still wondering, this is not just divine, this is not divine favor, right? This is divine wisdom, right? Or light, or even sometimes comfort, right? But it's not like divine providence in the sense of Maimonides is not a miracle that God does for you. It's not favor, right? It's wisdom. Divine providence is divine wisdom that with it you're able to find your way out. Okay, more on this in a second. All right, any questions on the general direction we're taking before I get in the text? Okay, let's get in the text. Okay, so let's go to page 166, which is where he begins this notion, right? And go to the second paragraph. I believe that divine providence. Put your hand in the screen if you have it. Okay, great. So he says this: I believe that divine providence extends in this lower sublunar world. Okay, sublunar, I think one of you was wondering what that was. Sublunar is under the moon. That's us, right? We are under the moon. I don't know why he calls it like I think he's quoting Aristotle. I think Aristotle calls our world like that. That's why he uses this fancy description. Extends in this lower sublunar world alone and only to human individuals, right? And so he continues, yeah. Let me stop on that, right? So let me reiterate, right? So in this passage, if you read through it, he actually, hold on. Yeah, if you read through it, he quotes Aristotle. So he actually agrees with Aristotle that God is not the source of our suffering, right? God is simply the creator, sets the world in motion. Aristotle believes that, Maimonides believes that, both of them agree. And then leaves it, and whatever is going on, whatever evil is overcoming the world, that's us, right? So this is actually great already response to the problem of evil, right? We tend to always want to blame God, and we forget our personal responsibility as human beings in the creation of 99% of the evil in the world, right? So it's too easy to project onto God and be like, why did you do this? Well, he's not doing anything, we are, right? So God kind of leaves us to our own devices, right? Both Aristotle and Maimonides agree that God creates this space where we can then, right, make our lives happen, right? So it's in a way, God is retreating for us to have the freedom to become who we want to become, right? Kind of like a parent allows the adolescent child, hopefully should, to make their mistake, do their own thing, doesn't intervene. That's God, right? For Maimonides and Aristotle, right? In order for human beings to really have free will, God has to step back. And so here we are with all the freedom in the world, and that's what we did with it. So why are we blaming God, right? No, we want God to intervene. What, you want to be a baby? Again, right? You want to lose your free will? That would be what Aristotle and Maimonides would say. We need to take responsibility, right, for the evil that we have brought into the world and stop blaming, right? Now, unlike Aristotle, who thinks, that's it, we're stuck there, Maimonides actually thinks that we can actually find a way out of the mess that we find ourselves in, whether it's our society or our family or even our own, habits, right, or DNA, heredity, right? Maimonides does believe it's possible to rise above our suffering and do something about it and transform it, right? So he doesn't believe that we're stuck, right? We are not the victims of fate. This is where Maimonides differs from many, many thinkers from the ancient world, right? He believes, yeah, there's fate, but we can rise above it, right? Yeah, I was fated to be in this family, to suffer this disease, to grow up in this, community, but I can rise above my fate. Actually, there's a beautiful story in the Talmud, which we all know what it is now, hopefully, which illustrates this very nicely. This is a story of Abraham. Did I tell you the story with Abraham who went to see a psychic? Did I tell you the story? Put your hand in the screen. Yes or no? Okay, no, thank you. Okay, so Abraham, whom you know, right? Remember, Abraham had trouble having a child. He was already very old, and his wife and him couldn't have children. And God had promised him a child, but he was pretty old and he wasn't seeing it coming out, right? So in a moment of weakness, right, Abraham, the Talmud says, Abraham goes to see a psychic, an astrologer. The astrologer does his chart and she confirms there is no children in your chart. You're not meant to have children. That's your fate. And so, Abraham is kind of, like, how you are when you leave the psychic and they said something you didn't like. So he's all depressed and he goes to God and he's like, yeah, the astrologer said that in the stars, there was no child for me. And God looks at him and he says, I am above the stars. Right? So this is exactly it, right? God is above the stars and we are above the stars. We have the power to rise above our astrological charts, our fate, our DNA, our conditioning, and the mess we're in, basically, right? So that's what Maimonides believes. Now, why are we capable of that? According to Maimonides, why? Anyone tell me, what do we have that can bring us out of the mess we are in, Aline?
Our reason.
Exactly, right? We have this bridge, right, to divine providence, to the divine light. So God doesn't intervene, but he is willing to flow into human beings' mind, right? So anytime you have an issue, you're dealing with some mess and chaos and conditioning and bad habits and suffering, right? Your mind actually can become a receptacle for divine wisdom, right? In other words, you can then receive the appropriate wisdom that you need to begin to climb out of your mess, right? So notice that God doesn't intervene here with a big miracle, right? Maimonides is not that type of believer. He's a rationalist, right? I know many believers go to church and synagogue, they pray, please get me out of this mess, get me out of this mess. Maimonides would be like, God is not gonna get you out of this mess. You're the only one who can get out of this mess. But if you open yourself up to divine providence, which means divine wisdom, you can receive the guidance and the light and the strength and the wisdom to begin yourself the long journey out of your mess, right? So no miracles for Maimonides, no divine intervention, right? We're in charge of our own destiny, but we can get this kind of gift, right? Wisdom, light, guidance, right? So that's what he means, right? That divine providence extends to human individuals. And why just us? Because we're the only ones who have this apparatus, right? Reason, this vessel. The animal doesn't have. He has kind of instinct, but he doesn't have this vessel that can open up to divine light and divine guidance. Milgram, would you like to comment on your comment?
I mean, I don't have so much to say about it. I happen to really like this argument, and I've learned it before briefly. But like just what I wrote is that he's very idealistic in the sense that like you are in control of your own destiny, and like you can get out of any like bad or harmful situation regardless of what it is, which I guess like practically might not always be possible, but like from like a philosophical perspective, it's like very promising and idealistic of him, and I happen to like it.
Yeah, very good. Yes, absolutely. So then, of course, he quotes, right, the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as examples. Now, examples, right? So one of you was mad at Maimonides at that point, saying, well, why is he quoting the Bible to make his point? But he's not, right? He's just, remember, he's between two traditions. So he has just spoken the Aristotelian language, and now he's bringing in the biblical language to connect the two, right? He's saying here, Aristotle and biblical vision connect, right? They both say, well, his interpretation of Aristotle, right? So he's just using them as examples, but really his proof is the very the Greek idea that we have reason that connects to the divine, right? This is a Greek idea, not so much a Hebrew one, right? So he's quoting Aristotle and then saying, oh, and by the way, see how it plays out in the biblical characters, but they are not the proof, right? He wouldn't do that. His proof is Aristotle. Okay, now what's interesting is that one might wonder, well, how is it that there's still people suffering, even though we have this vessel, and yet we still witness so much suffering in the world? Why isn't God pouring into everybody's reason? And of course, the reason of that is that we don't all have the same capacity. So let's look at that and talk about that a little bit. He says this, right? Page 169, third paragraph, last sentence. Are you there? 169, third paragraph, last sentence. Put your hand in the screen. Therefore, providence. Okay. So this, therefore, providence extends to everyone who is affected by this emanation, everyone who has reason. Now, to the extent that that being is gifted with reason. In other words, the more reason you have, the better your vessel, the more divine wisdom. If your vessel is not good, we all have the vessel, right? But some of us, our vessel is small, some of us, our vessel is cluttered, and so we can't receive, right? So he's saying all of us have that possibility, have the potential to connect. But there are two problems. I'm going to write them down and we're going to talk about them. Number one, the problem, the vessel is too small. And number two, the vessel is too cluttered, right? And so most human beings, their vessel is so small, they get just a trickle of divine providence, and so they lead miserable lives, right? Or their vessel is too cluttered with we'll see what next time. But I can tell you already, cluttered with prejudices, misconceived, with like untruths, falsehoods about how to live, right? Wrong teachings, cluttered, can't receive, right? And that's why he says so many of us still suffer, even though we have this, right? All of us. Wilkes, speak to us.
So is he trying to say that through your mind you can rise above suffering? Like, is he not like thinking about it in the spiritual way? Because it doesn't seem like too spiritual to me. Like, I understand, but I don't know.
You got it. It's not spiritual at all. In fact, the mind is just reason, right? And that's why, and let me add to that, that's why he says, even if you're pious, if you're a religious person, if your mind is small, you have no connection with the divine. Because for Maimonides, unlike Christianity and unlike also Sufism, which we'll study next, where God connects with the heart, for Maimonides, no, God connects here, right? So, and he connects in a very intellectual way, right? This is Greek. Maimonides is more of a Greek than a Hebrew in many ways. When he's writing, he sounds like a Greek philosopher, right? So it's not at all a spiritual experience. The only people who have this kind of spiritual connection you're talking about and can get away with it are the prophets, right? But we're a little below. We're the learned, right? And so you're right, religion plays no role. In fact, I would venture to argue that for Maimonides, and I think he says it, even if you're a complete pagan, but you have a good reason, you can become very powerfully attuned to the divine wisdom. That's why he says in 169, men of virtue and the pious. They're different. A man of virtue is a pagan who has good reason and therefore very closely connected to the divine. And then you have the pious, which is also, we'll see how that works, right? But so yeah, so you're right, Wilkes, you're capturing it very well. It's not a mystical, spiritual, religious thing here. It's simply how good is your mind. And if your mind is good, God will flow into it. Does that make sense, Wilkes? Did I answer your question? Wilkes?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Milgram, you want to add? Go ahead.
I have a question. I'm wondering if we know how much Maimonides' like atmosphere / like where he lived like influenced what he said, because he was living amongst like many other religions and cultures. And I don't think it's like, or like I'd be willing to argue that it's not a coincidence that his argument is like farther from religion and much more something that people of all different faiths and styles and whatever can like understand and relate to, because it just has to do with like thought and like intellect. So yeah, that's my question.
Absolutely. Maimonides is, in first of all, in many ways, he's very Greek because he's reading Aristotle and he's thinking a lot like Aristotle. He does have some Hebrew, right? This notion of divine favor, divine intervention, but it's still intellectual. So he's a blend, right? Maimonides is a hybrid between Greek and Hebrew. He's definitely not thinking like the Muslim theologians who are, although he is thinking like the Muslim philosophers, right? So like Averroes. So yeah, he's absolutely influenced by the spirit of the times, right? Averroes is talking the same way. Remember, Averroes is the Muslim counterpart of Maimonides. Let me write his name again for you guys, right? Very important philosopher. Same stature, right, as Maimonides. So yeah, absolutely. It's a very almost secular argument. Anyone, in a way, can achieve divine providence. Now, this is the interesting part, is that for Maimonides, connecting to God, you don't have to be religious. In fact, for Maimonides, he clearly says it's not enough to be religious. You also have to have a good mind. Now, can anyone tell me why faith is not enough to receive divine providence? Why do you also need a good mind? Anyone have any ideas? And then I'll explain. Why is it that being a religious person, so let's imagine a religious person, you do all your prayers, you love God, you love your synagogue or your church or your mosque, right? Your temple, you do sacrifices, you bring offerings, and your life is miserable. Why? Why? Let's see. Let's start with Suresh and then Milgram.
Just to say in general, if you have a positive mind, you have a positive spirit, which means you'll be closer to God in a sense, because
Yes.
everything is pure.
But can't you be a believer and have a positive spirit? Like you're joyful, you love God. You have hope and faith. That's positive, right? Is it just that? Milgram, help Suresh.
What I was going to say is that if God's like not involved in you having a better life or helping you through your struggles, then it doesn't really matter how religious and dedicated you are. Like that can be for yourself, but like practically it's not going to help you get out of like a mess if God has nothing to do with your mess or won't help you in your mess.
Very good, right? Since God comes through the mind, all the religious rituals are not really doing anything to your mind, right? You have to cultivate your mind. In other words, if your mind is too small or if your mind is too cluttered, no matter how many times you go to church, you can't connect. This is the problem of most church goers, most synagogue goers, most mosque goers. They go and they go and they go, but their mind never gets broadened, never gets uncluttered, and so they have no true. Now, Maimonides goes even further, and I'll be with you in a second, Will, so let me just finish this line of thought. He goes even further and says, believers who do not cultivate their reason are easily prey to what he calls idolatry. Now, can anyone tell me why he says that? First of all, what is idolatry? And then we'll see how it connects to a lack of reason. And then I'll come to you, Wilkes, I promise. Wilkes, go ahead.
Oh no, I'm just raising my hand for the other point.
Oh, okay. Hold that thought a little bit. So let's see. Wrestler, what is idolatry?
So idolatry is like idol worship. Like I guess it's when you go beyond your own religion and seek out other religions.
Okay, good. But how can you be idolatrous and
Beginning?
still? How can you be idolatrous and still be within your own religion? Because that's what he seems to imply. You can be a Jew who is idolatrous because your reason is not functioning. What's the connection between idolatry and a dysfunctional reason? Alim, would you like to answer that?
Okay, so I looked it up and it said that idolatry is the worship of something or someone else other than God, as though it was God. So I think if you don't have reason, you don't perceive the correct God. So therefore, if you like are like blind to reason, and you go to church, you're worshiping not the real God. You're worshiping like the another idea of God. Like I feel like it's like the idea of God that Job saw at the start of his story. So
You got it. Very good. Right? If your mind is small, you're going to have a small perception of God. And it's going to be an idol. What's an idol? An idol is a small perception of God. Let me write this down, right? Idolatry simply means a narrow perception of God, right? It used to be the reduction of God to an object, right? A physical object, which is really just a narrow perception of God, right? When you make an idol, what are you doing? You're taking the Almighty and putting him in a little thing, right? This is bringing broad into small. That's idolatry. Idolatry as a general movement, right? As a gesture, the gesture of idolatry is not just making little clay figures, right? It's bringing something big and making it small. That's idolatry. And you can be guilty of conceptual idolatry. Idolatry of your narrow perception of God, because your mind is narrow, you have a narrow perception of God. At that moment, says Maimonides, you are guilty of the sin of idolatry, Jew as you are, Muslim as you are, right? For him, the Christians are already idolatrous. So, right? So that's the idea. What Maimonides is saying is that even if you love God and you worship him, if your mind is small, you're going to have a small perception, you're going to be idolatrous, and therefore, of course, you're going to have a miserable life because you are worshiping an idol, a small view of God. So you'll have a small view of what he wants, of his wisdom, of what he decrees for you. And you're going to have a small, narrow, miserable life too, right? So that's the idea, right? Unless you cultivate your reason, even if you love God, you are not going to perceive God. You need to broaden your mind in order to really apprehend God, right? And we'll talk about how he proposes to do that in a second. Okay, let's get a few questions. I see a lot of you dying. Oh, no, only Wilkes is left. Wilkes!
Well, I just wanted to bring back to the point when we were talking about how faith was not enough. Similarly to the book of Job, like Job loved God, he worshiped God, but it was kind of more of the rules rather than actually focusing on the connection with God. And kind of like this, you know, a lot of people will, a lot of religious people think that they're doing good and think that it's enough to just follow the rules. But it's kind of like when you're just listening to the word of the church and the word of like scripture, you're not really reaching that spiritual realm. So I understand what Maimonides is trying to say here. You need to go beyond just like you need to expand your mind. That's kind of what Job had to go through before he could really connect to God, because he just had this like small-minded perception of who God was. And then when he finally connected to the metaphysical world, he then understood like he had faith and reason.
Very good. Excellent. You absolutely got it, right? Likewise, Job, in many ways, was idolatrous in the beginning, in the prologue, because he had a narrow view of God. And his mind is then expanded through his suffering, and he sees, right? He even says himself, I had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. He truly has a revelation once his mind has expanded through the suffering, right? Now, here's the question. If we need our mind to expand so that we can receive divine providence and divine wisdom, what is the path that Maimonides tells us we need to take in order to expand our mind? See if any of you remember what I said last time. What can we do to expand our mind so that we can receive as much as possible of divine wisdom and get out of this mess? What should we do? Yes, Alim, go ahead.
Okay, so you have to like study like other cultures, or you have to like, or you can like doubt your own religion, or like be skeptical, because you have to like see with your logic. Yeah.
Right? Absolutely. That's where Maimonides says we need to step out of our tradition and expand our mind by studying other traditions. Of course, for him, the main tradition to study is the Greek tradition, right? If you as a Jew step out of your culture, your religion, study Greek philosophy, physics, astronomy, metaphysics, then your mind will become strengthened and broadened so that when you come back to when you open up to divine providence, your mind is large, right? It has been expanded. And so that's what he proposed. Now, this is insane. Basically, he's saying every believer who wants to connect to God has to learn something that broadens their mind. Now, let me bring it home to you, how you can do that. Let me ask you this question. I want you to tell me I want you to think of the worst subject that you're really bad at, that you're trying to avoid actually in your undergrad experience. You're trying to not take that class. Everybody has the subject in mind? Okay, now tell me what it is. Let's see. You can put it in the chat if you want. Or Suresh, yeah, go ahead, Suresh. You can talk.
So far, all my courses have been just straight up reading from a text, nothing to do with calculations.
So what? So just what? What'd you say?
So far, I've taken courses that have been mostly vocabulary based and in a textbook, nothing with calculations.
Okay. So you're like the rest of them. I'm seeing a whole lot math, physics, math, physical chemistry, science. Okay, now guess what Maimonides would tell you? What do you think Maimonides would tell you need to do to deepen your relationship with God?
Will probably tell us to like take math courses.
Yeah, exactly. He would say, whatever your mind is resisting, that's because your mind is small there. Take math. All of you who wrote math, you would need to take more math classes to broaden and strengthen your mind so that you can receive even more divine light. So whatever courses we feel are like, I don't want to do this, that's the indication that right there you have an opportunity to expand your mind, right? So that's the idea. That's what he's saying, right? That we need to do. Next time we'll talk about the purification of the mind, but today we're talking about the expansion of the mind, right? And only then, right, do we really have a strong, broad vessel to receive the divine wisdom, to know how to get out of the messes we're in, right? Okay, now let's finish with his small commentary on Job. Right? We've read Job, we know Job very well. So I'm on page 172, where he talks about Job. Can anyone summarize to me what does Maimonides believe that Job ultimately had to learn? What did Job have to learn? What's the highest level? Right? So far we know we have to learn, expand our mind, receive divine wisdom, but there is an even higher way to rise above suffering, according to Maimonides. And he thinks that Job has found it. What is it? Right? Because clearly Job didn't receive any guidance, right? He didn't really get out of his mess till God kind of, intervened. So what did Job learn that is an even higher level? Ucho, you're very close. Elaborate, tell us. Turn on your mic.
I think Job didn't communicate with God directly. Like, I can't explain. Kind of like he.
Is that what Maimonides says about Job on page 172?
I don't have the book actually. I'm reading the wrong book, so.
You're guessing.
Yeah.
Your guess is not bad, though. Your guess is not far from the truth.
Yeah.
Can anyone help Ucho to... Yes, very good, Swavely. Would you like to elaborate? Tell us what you just wrote.
So he says that true happiness consists in knowing God, and that's in store for all those who know him. And like he was placing his happiness in the wrong things when he was, cared about his family and his wealth and all that, and he really should have just been trying to learn more about God to find happiness.
Very good, you got it. In other words, God is not just there to get you out of your mess and give you wisdom, right? Ultimately, what Job learned is that the highest form of happiness and divine providence is simply knowing God, right? Being in the presence of God, having full access to God. At that moment, right, Maimonides says, no matter what happens to you, even if you can't get out of it, right? Because there are moments where we can't get out of our suffering. Even if we have all the wisdom in the world, we are meant to suffer that thing, right? And so even when we can't get out of it through, right, we can still rise above it, right? We saw how we can get out of it, right? We say divine wisdom and we can find our way out of the mess we're in, but there are moments in life where you can't get out of the suffering. Somebody dies, right? You have a breakup or you lose something. You're stuck there. You can't start to solve it, right? No matter how intelligent you are. And so what Maimonides is saying is that we can still rise above, and the only way to truly weather the storm, he says, is to be anchored in God, is to have pure access to just simply the divine presence. And at that moment, he says, no matter what happens to you, you remain unmoved. You remain calm in the storm, right? So let's read what he says here. On page 172, you see the 3 stars in the middle of the last paragraph? Put your hand on the screen if you see the 3 stars. Okay, just one person. Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to read from there. This is why this opinion is attributed to Job. However, Job only said these things as long as he was not in possession of true knowledge of God, but knew God by hearsay. As soon as he obtained reliable knowledge of God, he realized that true happiness, which consists in knowing God, right? In other words, it's just enough to be in the hand of God, to be in the presence of God. At that moment, you have already risen above everything. You know, it's the peace that surpasses understanding, right? In the Christian tradition, right? It's in the peace in the middle of the storm. It's this crazy stability that you feel inside of you, even when everything is falling apart. That's what he's talking about, right? He realized that true happiness, which consists in knowing God, is in store for all those who know him, and none of all those afflictions can dull it, right? Job thought, he continues, that true happiness was solving your problem, right? Having kids and blessings and getting out of the mess, right? And it's true in a certain degree. It's good to be able to solve the problem and get out of the problem, but there are problems we can't get out of, right? And at that moment, we need to understand that the true highest form of happiness is not just divine guidance, how to resolve your issues, it's the divine presence itself, right? At that moment, if you have that, you have everything, right? You can really have a strong anchor in the middle of the chaos. And that's how he finishes, right? So Maimonides is really, really kind of a mystic, right? At this point here, right? So you see how Maimonides, he speaks the language of a rationalist up until a certain point, and then he breaks into mysticism, right? Which is this union with God, presence of God, right? So he is kind of a double personality, right? He does have a strong secular rationalist argument, but he can't help himself. It's like he breaks into song, like in a musical, right? He can't help himself. All of a sudden, like I told you, remember, there's an explosion of light. This is one of them, right? Where he is saying basically union with God is what really matters, right? Not fixing our problems. Okay, any questions on anything I said, or objections, or concerns, or disagreements? Okay, everyone understood what I said? Put your hand on the screen. Okay, great. I love that. I love that. Okay, good. So next time, again, the reading assignment, right? Next Tuesday. I think we have school. I can't keep track. There's so many holidays. So yeah, and at that point, we're going to learn about how to unclutter the mind. It's not enough to have a broad mind. If your mind is cluttered, it's not going to work either. So how do we purify the mind? That's what the next text is about. Okay, so I hope you enjoy it. I wish you all a happy Jewish New Year. It's a Jewish New Year this Friday. And yeah, that's it. I'm going to stop the recording.